Hello, listeners, and welcome to another episode of Cognitive Dissidence. As usual, I'm your host. I'm Jacob Shapiro. I'm a partner and the director of geopolitical analysis at Cognitive Investments. Joining me on the podcast today is Enrique Fonseca. He is the co-founder of Visual Politic. He says at the end of the episode where you can check out more Visual Politic's work. Fonseca and I have known each other for a couple of years now. We actually collaborated on LATAM Politic for, I guess that was a year and a half there, where we were supplying some written geopolitical content for LATAM Politic. In any case, I asked him to come on the podcast to discuss the situation in Spanish politics with the Spanish government bringing forward elections to next month. This is recording on June 20th. It's a Tuesday here, a very hot day in New Orleans. We'll probably post this in the next couple of days because I don't want it to get stale. This was not our normal sort of level conversation. We delve into some things about politics and identity politics, and I don't even want to get into the whole should it get canceled, not get canceled. I thought Fonseca and I had some interesting viewpoints. We obviously differ on some things, and we talked about sort of where politics was going. I'm sure some people will find something to be offended about, but this is really just two political analysts trying to figure out what's going on in Spanish politics and playing around with those ideas and those concepts. So I hope you enjoy it. If not, jacob@cognitive.investments is my email address. You can email me there to tell me why you didn't, or hopefully you'll email me there to talk about how you want to avail yourself of our wealth management services or some of our research services that we offer. So if any of that sounds good, please email me there. Otherwise, cheers and see you out there. Cognitive Investments LLC is a registered investment advisor. Advisory services are only offered to clients or prospective clients where Cognitive and its representatives are properly licensed or exempt from licensure. For additional information, please visit our website at www.cognitive.investments. The information provided is for educational and informational purposes only and does not constitute investment advice, and it should not be relied on as such. It should not be considered a solicitation to buy or an offer to sell a security. It does not take into account any investor's particular investment objectives, strategies, tax status, or investment horizon. You should consult your attorney or tax advisor. All right, Fonseca, you've done your vocal exercises. We've been dancing around doing this podcast for a while, and everybody is prepared. You're the first podcast guest that has done vocal exercises before I've hit the record button, so you can have that distinction. Nice to have you on the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me, Jacob. You know, it's a pleasure to be here. And yes, vocal exercises are really important, especially if you're going to record before recording, because they make you vocalize better. It's like doing gym with the muscles of your face, because in your face you have lots of muscles, and we never train those. And those are the ones that you use when you are talking, especially if you are going to speak in a foreign language. Like it's my case, I'm Spanish. So as you can tell, English is not my native language. So this really helps. So yeah.
Also,
I can tell you later which ones
Great.
are those.
I look forward to it because our listeners will have the benefit of listening to somebody who's properly warmed up on the podcast for the first time. We're here to talk about Spanish elections. And this is actually on the podcast, we've been talking about countries on the periphery. No offense to Spain. You guys aren't sort of the center of the geopolitical world in general. We had a New Zealand guest on a couple weeks ago, but I like getting views from the periphery. And there's a lot of interesting things going on in Spain. So before we kind of dive into what's going on now, maybe you could just give the listeners a brief recap of the recent decision by the Spanish government to pull forward elections, and what is at stake here in the next 6 to 8 weeks in Spain's political system.
So basically, we had local and regional elections in May this year, and it was such a landslide defeat by the party coalitions, the government, the coalition government that we had in Spain, which is a left-wing coalition between the Social Democrats, which are center-left. You can say they are kind of like the Spanish version of the Democrats, the Democratic Party, and a radical left party that used to be called Podemos. Now nobody knows how they are called. And it was such a brutal defeat, and a defeat that was not explained by economical factors. It was just like people disapproved the government practice during these 4 years, that the prime minister declared he moved forward the elections, the national elections. They were meant to be in December this year, but he said, okay, listen, let's do it in July. So we're going to have elections in July. We're going to have national elections in July. And nobody knows what's going to happen. But chances are that like all the polls and most of the predictions now, they claim that we might have a victory of the center right, if not a coalition between the center right and the radical right, which it's another political party that we also have, and they might support the government of the center right party. So this is more or less the most neutral, objective, and executive summary I could make of the situation.
Yeah, and I'm sure you'll get less objective as we go here. But I'm glad you brought up the issue about economic performance, because Spain grew at 5.5% last year. The Bank of Spain just today revised GDP growth rates upward from 1.8 to 2.3%. The latest inflation reading in the European Union, average inflation in the European Union is at 6.1%. Just as an aside, I didn't realize Hungary is sitting out there with 21.9% inflation. That's almost double any other country in the bloc. We're going to have to come back. I'm going to have to come back and talk about that a little bit more. Spain, though, is sitting there at 2.9%. Only Luxembourg, Belgium, and Denmark have lower inflation than Spain. So you're doing well there. Youth unemployment, which is the stat I would always trot out if I was talking about Spain and didn't have time to actually do the research. Youth unemployment's at its lowest level since the 2008 financial crisis. Spain also invested a lot of money in energy infrastructure that the rest of Europe didn't. So when the Russia-Ukraine war happened, Spain was the country with the most LNG capacity in Europe, which goes into why those inflation figures are so low. All of which is to say, so why on earth are people unhappy with this Spanish government? I mean, I'm jealous of this record. I wish the U.S. government had such a good record in terms of economic performance. So how do we explain this disjuncture between the Spanish economy seems to be doing well, and maybe we can problematize that a little bit, and yet the Spanish government has come under significant pressure?
Yes, that's the real mystery, right? Like, we've never seen these results. Like, I used to work in elections. I worked in the national elections 2011. That was a landslide victory for the Conservatives. And it was very easy to understand. We had a huge crisis and the government was led by the socialists. So, of course, eventually people would blame them for the bad economical performance of Spain. And, of course, they were meant to lose. Everybody knew that they would lose. But in this case, you're right. The economical perspective of Spain is better than ever in the last 15 years. And still people are incredibly unhappy, but so unhappy that the left has lost the power in so many cities that would used to be a stronghold of the left. Like, for American viewers, imagine that one day the Democrats win in Texas, or the Republicans win in California, or, it's an entire change of color. It's, in a way, it reminds of the red wave of Ronald Reagan against Mondale in 1984, it was. Like, it's landslide victory or a landslide defeat. So, yeah, it's very hard to explain. And I think that we could summarize it with one word. Go woke, get broke. I think this has been the most quintessential, and I think this is the reason why these elections can be interesting for other people in different countries. It can be interesting also for corporations, because I think this has been the case study of what happens when you embrace some trends that you thought they will be very, profitable in terms of votes, in terms of popular support, and it turns out that it's the opposite. Because if you look at the election data closely, you will realize that, yes, the center left, like the Socialist Party, we can call them the Social Democrats, because they are not really socialists, they are more Social Democrats, but in Spain we call them the Socialists, los Socialistas. They lost, they had less votes than 4 years ago, but they didn't lose so many. The ones who really got an enormous defeat was the radical left, which is the coalition partners of the government. That's why they moved the election forward, because basically the Prime Minister, Pedro Sanchez, he knows that the more he stays in power, the more votes the left is going to lose. And what he wants to do now is, in a way, make all the left unite against the socialists again.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know what's going to happen in the next elections, but one thing I'm fairly sure, it's going to be a comeback of the bipartisan politics. Or not clear bipartisan politics, but it's going to be much more bipartisan than how it used to be in the last 5 years.
Well, I mean, we should hack into that a little bit because poll. We're recording here on June 20th. This will come out in a couple days. A poll by a Spanish newspaper said it looks like
Which newspaper?
Well, I can't pronounce it, so it's PAIS. How do I pronounce that? I've never pronounced that. There
El País.
Go.
El País.
Listeners,
It's a center-left party.
Sorry.
Center-left newspaper. Just to clarify, this is important because the polls in the last 5 years, they've been incredibly polarized. That's why, like, for example, we have the National Institute of, our national pollster is a state-owned company, that it's a pollster. And nobody trusts their data anymore because it's completely biased towards what the government wants.
Well, then the poll results say that the People's Party, which is the Conservative Party, has widened its lead on the Socialists, and that they're looking at getting between 128 to 142 seats in the lower house, which is up from the 131 in the previous poll, and is maybe 20 or 30 seats above kind of what the Socialist Party would get. So, but maybe the leftist newspaper wants people to be afraid of the right and the far right, and that might be part of the problem with your argument, because it doesn't look bipartisan to me. Sanchez has a point here that the far right Vox party is sort of waiting in the wings, wanting to partner with the conservatives, because the conservatives can't form a majority on their own unless you get this huge red wave that you're talking about.
Yeah. No. I mean, it might be. There's a high chance that the next government of Spain is going to be a coalition between the center right and the radical right. Mm-hmm. There's a huge chance. I still don't know if it's going to happen. And we've seen something similar in Madrid, for example. Madrid is one of the biggest regions of Spain. It's the capital, but it's also a region. It's sort of a state. And it's traditionally conservative. The pollsters, initially, they prognosticated a coalition between the far right and the right. And what happened was that the right won an absolute majority, so they didn't need to partner with the far right. So this is something that can happen as well.
Before we hack into the go woke, go broke thing, I do just want to point out that, and at least that this might be one explanation for what's going on, because even though the top line economic figures are good, one of the reasons the top line economic figures are so good is tourism. So tourism is 30% larger than it was before the pandemic, and tourist spending is 23% higher than it was in the previous record in 2019. So a lot of Europeans, and I guess Americans and everybody else, are coming to Spain and having vacation, and that doesn't exactly help normal working class worker. Private consumption in Spain has also been falling for 2 quarters, and household purchasing power has fallen as well. So when you actually start getting into, okay, well, somebody's profiting, the Spanish economy is doing well in some ways, it's not doing well in some other ways, but it's still really hard to make sense of why the Spanish government would be struggling so much. And I guess the question I want to lean in.
Well,
oh yeah, please.
Let me stop you here for I think one thing is important to clarify. Spanish economy, generally speaking, is not doing good. Like, we still have I don't know what's the figures of young unemployment rate, but we're talking, I think it's like the general unemployment rate is 12%, for example. 12% of unemployment rate is unacceptable in America and in many other countries. The difference is that in Spain, we used to have 25% unemployment rate 10 years ago. So compare with where we come from, now the Spanish economy is doing better. That is true. But it's still doing really bad. Like, it's still 12% of people don't have a job.
I hear...
And the salaries and the purchasing power parity of the Spaniards has been declining in the last 10 years.
No doubt.
Not so heavily, not so steadily as the Italians, for example, but our economic performance there's a far range of improvement. Okay? Like, we are doing good now. Yes, we're doing better than before. And it's not only about the tourism, it's also about the Ukraine war. Like, the war in Ukraine, who does it affect? It does affect Hungary, of course, Czech Republic, Germany. Those are the countries that used to be very reliant on Russian gas. But Spain was never reliant on Russian gas. It's not that we built all this LNG capacity to protect ourselves against Russia. It's that we have most of our gas coming from America, from Algeria. Like, we don't have any pipe connecting Spain with Russia because Russia is very far. Like, just look at the map. There is like from Madrid to, and I live in Czech Republic, in Prague. Most of our gas used to come from Russia. There is 2,000 kilometers. Like, okay, it's Europe, but Europe is big and wide, and Spain is an island. It always was an island. I mean, it's not an island, okay, but like metaphorically speaking, it always was like an island in terms of energy. And also in terms of trade. We never traded with Russia. We had some trade with Russia, of course, but it was not an important trade partner as it was for Germany or Czech Republic or Finland or Sweden, you know. So that's why whenever, for example, here in Czech Republic, my gas bill has increased by 5-fold. I used to pay 10,000 crowns. Now I pay more than 5,000 crowns a month. That is more than $200 in gas. The Spaniards, they didn't have that spike. So that also explains why inflation rates are not so high compared with other countries. Like, this is a crisis. You can say that all the crises that came from the war in Ukraine, Spain was predetermined to suffer less than other countries.
Yes.
Unlike COVID, for example, where Spain was one of the most damaged countries.
Well, yeah, and you see that in some of the tourism data. But I think this actually connects very specifically with what we're talking about, because if we go back into the history of into the recent history of the Spanish left, and I'm obviously not an expert here, but Podemos, which, well, I don't know if they identify as Podemos or what they identify as right now, but the party that was Podemos, my understanding is that in 2014, they really made a name for themselves by staking out an anti-austerity policy. So if you go back in your head sort of a decade plus, this is when the Germans are enforcing austerity on the pigs. So that's Portugal and Spain and Greece and Italy and all these profligate spending countries from the German point of view. Spain had just watched what happened to Greece, which is going to be paying, loads of debt out to 2060 or something like that. And Germany was pushing through this austerity message, and Podemos became...
They have the same in Greece. Like there is an equivalent of Podemos in Greece, which was called Syriza, and it was also an anti-austerity party.
Well, and
with very similar positions, they stood for the same values, and it was the same ideology in a way.
But this is the point, which is somehow Podemos has gone from, anti-austerity was not so ideological. You can say that it was ideological, but that was an economic. It was an economic argument, though. It was, hey, Germany, we don't want the austerity. Thank you very much. Not there's a far left agenda that we want to implement in all of Spanish society.
No. That was not the case. No, that has never been the case. When we're in politics, we have to define, especially in elections, there are 3 different things we have to separate. One is the ideology, what you stand for, what are your values. This has nothing to do with the current situation. Are you a libertarian? Are you a Marxist? Are you a conservative? How conservative are you? This is your ideology. Then you have the strategy. How are you going to gain the confidence of the voters? Are you going to talk about economics? Are you going to talk about civil rights? Are you going to talk about austerity? And then there is the leadership. Those 3 things are completely different. So Podemos was a spin-off of the Communist Party. Mm-hmm. It was a spin-off of the party called Izquierda Unida, United Left, that was a coalition of parties, but mainly led by the Communist Party, and it was a coalition of far left parties. Podemos was a spin-off created by some academic scholars that used to work as advisors of the Izquierda Unida. They used to work as political strategists for them in elections, and they realized that as much as they shared the ideology, they didn't share the strategy. And in this field, we have to give them all the credit for having so much lateral thinking and coming up with a strategy that was like, I compare them with Google. It was a disruptive element, a disruptive player that came up with a completely innovative strategy orchestrated by, after having a deep knowledge of politics, political science. These guys were really smart, and they made a great strategy. And then leadership. Podemos was led by one person, Pablo Iglesias, that was incredibly charismatic. He was incredibly media savvy. He was going to all the talk shows. He knew how to talk. He knew how to give a speech. He knew how to be even funny, combine it with humor, combine it with a little bit of, and then they were talking about austerity because, of course, back in the day, that was what it was on the agenda. They couldn't talk about anything else. And of course, they were against austerity, but not because it was just, you can be against austerity because you are a social democrat or a Keynesian and you think that it's good that government spends more money, or you can be against austerity because you just have a fundamental difference with capitalism and the logic of capitalism. For example, Podemos in 2014, when they ran for the European elections the first time, one of the things that they had in the manifesto was getting out of the euro or making a referendum in Spain against the euro. That is not just an anti-austerity positioning. That is a completely breakaway from all the logics of capitalism. Okay, we need to balance the budget. And their ideology was always perfectly enrooted on Marxism, and not only Marxism. Like, it's true. For example, this is a debate that you can have if you go with some classical Marxist, they would disagree with Podemos. Like, it was not the pure Marxism of 1848 of the working class infrastructure. No, they were, let's say, post-Marxism. You can say, like, for example, one of their ideological godfathers, and they always claimed that it was like they never denied it. One of their the biggest intellectual figures of their thinking and their strategy was Antonio Gramsci. Antonio Gramsci is an Italian thinker that was a member of the Communist Party. Communism is not just one single ideology that has solutions for everything. There are so many different strains of communism.
Yeah, and you can say that. I mean, you can say that.
Let's not say communism if you want. Let's say Marxism or post-Marxism or radical left. I mean, we can fight with the terminology, but in a way, there is like a mindset that is completely different from what we can consider liberal politics. And when I say liberal politics, I'm not meaning the liberals of the Democratic Party. I'm talking about everything that the West is based on.
Everything. I mean, you're talking about classical liberalism, which...
Classical liberalism,
yes,
yeah.
Which, I mean, we could also say that, Marx and communism also comes from the tradition of the West. I mean, all these things come from the same place.
Yeah, well, it's Western, but
but okay. I mean... And I guess the technical term for Podemos would be democratic socialist if we really wanted to get into it. But I think that conversation is maybe
democratic. That's another conversation. But democratic socialist is more the social democrats, the socialist. The Socialist Party in Spain is a center-left party that has been always democratic socialism. Okay, they believe in a strong welfare state with high taxes, lots of social spending. But they are completely comfortable with a market economy, with private property, with pretty much what you have in Northern Europe or in Southern Europe. In Southern Europe, we don't have a free ride capitalism with lower taxes and the regulations. No, there is a strong welfare state. There are lots of regulations, and there is an aim on the government to try to promote equality. But this is different.
I mean, it's different, but these groups are all part of the same whole. And this is why we can talk about the ideology, but I would punt on the ideology debate and just say that there's no way that Podemos would have been popular, and it did not become the third largest party in Spain because it was peddling post-Marxist ideology. The reason I think that it became popular was because they were saying things like, hey, the Germans are mad at us for having this state. They also want us to buy their goods. This is not what the EU is supposed to be about. Free trade doesn't work for us.
Of course, but that is the strategy. That is not the ideology. That is the strategy. I have this ideology. I want to get here. And in order to get here, I need to create a narrative that it can be understood by people. And I need to talk about the problems of the people. And now what people care about is not an 8 hours labor day. What people care about now is austerity, budget cuts. The civil workers, the civil servants are seeing their salaries reduced. These type of things. That's what they were talking about.
Well, and I like, and maybe this is where we can sort of come together. Well, maybe we can agree. I don't know. Maybe you're going to tell me you disagree with this too. I think it's less that, like, yes, Podemos had a good. You can say that they had a good strategy. They were also just in the right place at the right time. It's not that they invented that narrative. That was a real narrative. If you want to look at the root causes of inequality and high unemployment rates in Southern European countries, it all becomes because it's part of a free trade system, which hey, I'm a free trade guy. If we want to get ideological, in the long run, I think free trade will probably work these things out, but not before there's immense...
No. I'm not discussing here ideology. I'm not coming up here as I am against them or not. No. Actually, in this case, I really admire them. I think they were amazing. And yes, they, in a different circumstance, probably they wouldn't have become so popular they wouldn't have gone from zero to hero in 4 months as they did. But, in Spanish, we always say, a toro pasado todos somos manolete, which means when the bull has gone, everybody's a great bullfighter. But it's not they knew how to read the moment and how to come up with a good strategy for that. It was not that obvious. And actually, you have lots of other parties that try to do the same, like the Five Stars movement, and they were not that successful. I mean, well, okay, they made it to the government, but I think they were much more... They had a clear roadmap. And if you study them, like I have a book that you can read, it's in Spanish. It's called El Método Podemos, Marketing Marxista para Partidos Políticos No Marxistas. And it's a book that studies their strategy. And it was brilliant. Like if you go through all their intellectual fundings, their intellectual foundations, you listen to their speeches and their conferences, like their lectures, because it was not only these guys, they were academia scholars, so they were not just giving political rallies and political speeches, they were also giving lectures. And in their lectures, they explain what's the roadmap and how are they going to do it. And they did. And they succeeded. So, sure, one key ingredient for them was the situation in that moment. It was an existential crisis in Spain, but it was also a really good strategy. Like, I think we should give them credit for that.
Yeah, my only point is...
Which was, in a way, was very similar to Donald Trump's strategy. Although Donald Trump comes with a completely different ideology, the strategy was the same.
Yes, but I guess it's a chicken egg sort of scenario, which is you have to be in the right place at the right time. It's not so much that, to me, the argument I'm making is that Podemos did not come up with a narrative and then impose the narrative on the Spanish electorate. The Spanish electorate was feeling something, and Podemos had their finger on the pulse and figured out, oh, these things work. And it seems to me what has changed between 2014 and 2023 is in 2014, they had their finger on the pulse. It was economic issues. It was austerity. It was frustration with the European Union. It was all these other things. Whereas today, as you point out, they are trying to push a narrative. The narrative is much more on ideological issues, on identity politics issues and things like that. They're actually not even talking about the Sanchez government is not talking about all the great economic progress that they've made. I know you were sort of making fun of Spain. Oh, we still have youth unemployment, for frame of reference listeners, is something like 28%. But that's down from like 45%. Like the situation's gotten much better. But the narrative from the Spanish government is like...
I'm not making fun of the situation. Like, I just put it in context. I said like, hey, the Spanish economy is doing better than before. But it doesn't mean that now we are doing great and we are driving Lamborghinis. No. Wait a minute. We're still a Southern European country with a lot of unemployment rate, with purchasing power declining, and lots of problems. The difference is that now the rest of the countries are doing worse because there's a war, and we are not that influenced by that war.
But the center left, the left and the center left in Spain doesn't seem to be talking about that. They're not talking about the progress they've made and the very real ways in which Spain has structural advantages going forward here, because the war is not over. Spain is going to be one of the biggest recipients of European COVID-19 aid. If they can point to this track record of progress and say we're going to manage things well, but it doesn't seem to me like they're not getting that message out. The message that the Spanish electorate is getting,
not, because they made a. Basically, what happened, this is what I give you a summary. Podemos started with this anti-austerity messaging and so on, and with a really good strategy and a good team and a good leadership. Because it was not only the leader, Pablo Iglesias, it was also the people he had behind. He had one of the, in my opinion, most genius political strategies that I've ever seen, which is Íñigo Errejón. If you read his PhD paper, it's porn for a political nerd. It's really well made, and he's a genius, in my opinion, one of a kind. And in 4 years, they made it from nobody knows us to we are making a coalition with the government. Then after that, they started making first a lot of, again, ideology, strategy, leadership. The leadership started making a lot of ego-driven decisions that made them fail and starting to get less accepted by society. That was a very important factor, because they started with this. It was not only an anti-austerity party, it was also an anti-establishment party. So one of the things they claim is that we will never live as those rich politicians that are getting mansions in the center of the city and living like millionaires, so they are getting disconnected from the society. We will always be men of the people. As soon as they made it to the government, the first thing the party leader did, Pablo Iglesias, was buying a mansion outside of the city. So, of course, people didn't accept that. People didn't buy that. They were like, man, you are the exact caricature that every right-wing person would make of a communist. As soon as you have money, you start living like a king. And you are taking advantage of desperate people, and this is what he did. So leadership started failing, and then they went through a spiral of infighting. Then the party split in different factions. Then they split in two different parties. There was Podemos on one hand, Más País on the other hand. Then little regional spin-offs in different places, because they couldn't create a cohesive party because of infighting and ego-driven decisions. So leadership failed. Strategy failed. And ideology and strategy, those failed because after the big bailouts and the big debt crisis happened, after that, they couldn't come up with more economical discourse anymore. And that's when they started embracing wokeism. More or less in that time is when the Me Too movement happened in America. And the Me Too movement reflected in Spain as, let's say, an evolution of feminism that was much more radical, much more based on this, not only identity politics, but also power struggle. So there was a big rape scandal in Spain. It was a very controversial case of rape that made the society get especially outraged, and with protests in the street and so on. And Podemos wanted to capitalize on that. They realized that with economics, you win the hearts of just the people who are very left out of the economical system, but there is much more identities that you can try to appeal. One of them is women. Women are 50% of the votes, so let's try to become the feminist party. Instead of being the Communist Party or the left-wing party or the anti-austerity party, now we will become the feminist party. And they made a completely transformation to the point that at the beginning the party was called Podemos. Then they want to be called Unidas Podemos. Together we can. But together we can, Unidas is in feminine. Mm-hmm. You know, like in Spanish language, everything has a gender. Like together in Spanish translates as, if we are talking about together, you and I, we are men, is unidos. But if we are women, we say unidas. So they started using this not gender neutral language, but even trying to promote feminine pronouns on everything, to the point that there was even moments where you could see Pablo Iglesias, the party leader, a man, talking about everyone as if they were women, and not even he never dared to refer to himself as a woman, but you can see pictures of Pablo Iglesias and all his party colleagues that were all men, and there was written in front, Unidas Podemos, and it was like this. And they started embracing a really radical feminist agenda, but to the point where they made, first, an anti-rape law that was initially meant to be much more, punishing more rapists than before, because they thought that the rapists are not punished enough. The problem is that the law was so poorly done that it turned out to soften a lot of penalties for many rapists. So there were like even 100 rapists that weren't released from jail because the law was poorly written. And their answer for that was, we blame it on the tribunals and our judicial system that is bigots. All the judges are bigots. They made campaigns signaling journalists and blaming them to be bigots. Like pretty much everything was being it was a matter of whoever stands against me is a bigot. And this became the center, the cornerstone of their agenda.
Well, and this to me actually gets to the real crux of the issue, because this is happening in Western politics everywhere, and it's not even a left or a right story. You said go woke, go broke. I was trying to figure out what the right wing version of that go. I don't know. Maybe a listener will help me with sort of the right thing. But I've always thought of political ideology as a circle. Like if you go far enough in the right or left direction, you're eventually going to bump into each other. And you alluded to earlier, in some ways, the best case scenario for this would be if one of the mainstream parties in Spain was able to secure a majority without it. Because if we go look at the Vox party, they're also playing up the identity politics thing. What's being lost here is the Spanish lower class, working class. I mean, the folks that are actually, might need actually some government support from, and that haven't enjoyed the economic growth that's been happening in Spain right now, or might need, future growth in general. No one seems to be talking to their issues on either the left or the right. Like if you go and look at Spanish press, like I don't see Spanish press talking about sort of these economic issues. I see all of these identity politics things, and I don't know, that's not about Spain. That's really something that's happening in general, and about how the radicals of both parties are capturing discourse. And I've never really known what to make of that.
I mean, with Vox, the Vox party, the far-right party in Spain, we might have the same problem. The problem is that they didn't make it to the government yet. But probably if they do, the center-right is going to have the same. Like, in a way, it's not only about wokeism, it's about identity politics in general, and how if you partner with a radical party, the radical party is going to hijack your agenda. And not only hijack your agenda, well, there is also another problem with another thing that also didn't play on Podemos' favor was the pandemic. Because during the pandemic is when in Spain, we were expecting the government to act. Also, part of the reasons why the pandemic went so bad in Spain was because of ideology. They tried to manage the pandemic with a lot of ideological ideas. I don't know how to say the ideological principles. And again, wokeism and feminism came into the picture here, because one thing that a lot of people blame the government for, and I think it's very fair to blame them for this, is that when Italy was already closing all the schools and making the quarantine measures, Spain was right next to Italy, and we didn't want to do it. The government didn't want to do it. They even denied. It's funny. A left-wing government in Spain behaved exactly the same as Donald Trump. At the beginning, they were denying COVID. They were saying that, no, this is not going to happen to Spain. We have a great healthcare system, so we know how to manage it. Don't worry, go out. And especially, remember that this was March the 8th. More or less, this was around March the 8th. March the 8th is the International Women's Day. So again, the government was so keen on pushing their feminist agenda that they wanted to do a main protest sponsored by the government to stand for women's rights and so on. And they wanted that protest to be huge. And actually, that protest was also an infighting between the government, because it was the center left and the radical left trying to see who is going to be the head of the protest. So they were going to the media, they were encouraged. You have, on one hand, one of the ministers of the government who was from Podemos, and another minister of the government who was from the Socialists. Both of them going to the newspapers, going to the TV, giving interviews, and encouraging everybody to go to this protest. The right in that moment was, including the far right, were the ones talking about COVID, talking about the pandemic, saying, no, you should close everything, please stop, don't do this, because then there's going to be a massive spread. And they were labeling all these people as fascists and bigots, that they don't want to stand for women's rights and so on. And they celebrated the protest, and then 2 days later they had to go to start the quarantine measures. But of course, the damage was already done, and this is one of the reasons why Spain had the biggest. There was a moment where Spain had the biggest infection rate and the biggest mortality rate in all across Europe.
Well, yeah, the I don't know what the right word is. The way that ideology came to dominate the COVID-19. I was actually having a debate with somebody about this last week. The lockdowns became very ideological very quick. And they shouldn't have been ideological. The logic behind the lockdowns was strictly from a policy perspective. We have a new virus. We have a disease that could overrun the healthcare systems. We have to lock down. Number one, maybe if we lock down for a couple weeks, we can stop it in its tracks. But secondly, and more importantly, we have to lock down long enough to give the healthcare system time to catch up so that the hospitals aren't overrun. And then once you hit that perspective, then it's about looking at mortality rates and looking at risks and letting people figure things out for themselves. And we never... in the West, we never, and not just in the West, in China too, we never got to the point where, okay, we have a virus. It's a pandemic. We're not going to be able to put the genie back in the box. We also can't stay locked down forever. This became the sort of major ideological ground. And this is where I would bring it back to Spanish politics here, which, you talked about, feminist agenda, things like that. I bet most of Spain agrees with most of these main principles. I drew up one poll here just to look at us. 76% of people in Spain, which is a historically Catholic country, a historically conservative country, are pro-gay marriage.
So no. First of all, no. Wait a minute.
No? First, you're looking bad. Okay.
There are many bias, many people maybe in America have with Spain. Spain is not a conservative country at all. Italy is conservative. Spain is not. Spain, after the dictatorship, we went through a democratic transition to the point that...
I agree. I meant the dictatorship was not that long ago, and when the dictatorship was in power, I would describe Spain as a movement. Yes.
There was a completely pendular movement. I went to a Catholic school, and I had sex education in my Catholic school, and an incredibly progressive sex education. Like when I was a child, gay marriage wasn't approved yet, but still, in my school, Catholic school, they were teaching me that gay people are okay, transgender people have their rights, blah, 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 blah. I was schooled about transgender rights before that was a thing. So Spain is incredibly progressive, even in the right. And actually, we were the second country on the planet in passing the gay marriage.
Yeah.
And sure, there was a little bit of protest and demonstrations and so on, but it was not that controversial. I mean, of course, it was controversial as much as it was the second country doing it, and of course, you're going to have a reaction always. But compared with any other country on the planet, other than maybe Sweden or I don't know what else, we are incredibly progressive when it comes to social rights. And this is why, at the beginning, when Podemos embraced this radical version of feminism, they thought it would be good because they were hitting on the money. They would captivate all the Spanish voters. The problem is when you start telling everyone who is against me is a bigot. The problem is not feminism. The problem is seeing everything on the basis of power play and power politics, power dynamics.
Yeah. Or put a different way, the problem is the capture of mainstream politics by radical ideologues on both sides.
Yes, that's it. And this is this is why I say go woke, get broke. It's not go feminist, get broke. No, the majority of the people, at least in Spanish politics, the Spanish society is incredibly tolerant. But you have to understand that there were moments where you had government campaigns scaring girls of going out on the street because they would get raped. Like, the government itself was claiming that I think it was like, according to their figures, 25% of the Spanish women have been raped at some point. There were like campaigns sponsored by the government telling women to watch out because if you go out of the discotheque and you go home, maybe they are going to rape you, and that all the men are to blame for this. And of course, that alienated the Spanish voters, the Spanish male voters and female voters. Like, for example, last year, they made a campaign. And when I say a campaign, I mean an advertising, institutional advertising paid with taxpayers' money, promoting body positivity on the beaches and making posters in all the schools saying, summer belongs to us. And you had a lot of body positive women on the beach. And it was like, oh, okay, like, of course, who is against this? No one. Like, I don't have any problem with seeing all kinds of bodies, men, women, trans, whoever on the beach. I don't have any problem. But the fact that the government is promoting those messages and trying to promote body positivity is like, why? Like, it was like very crazy to most of the Spanish voters. Of course, maybe you can say I'm biased. Of course, needless to say that I didn't vote for them and I wouldn't. But I think the message is clear. They try to embrace an agenda that seemed to be very profitable in terms of votes, and it was far from being profitable. It was the opposite. It made them radioactive. Like now, what I'm telling you now is just mainstream. Like, this is not I'm not in the far right at all, and I'm not particularly, actually, to me personally, as Enrique Fonseca, the biggest surprise is I couldn't imagine that so many people could be so alienated, and that this woke agenda could spark so much hatred. Because I never cared about this topic. Like, I didn't listen so much about all these culture wars or whatever you want to call it. I was more interested in, geopolitics. Maybe I'm more interested in free market versus interventionism and so on. I'm more interested in economics than in all this culture, politics, or whatever. I couldn't imagine that it would have such a massive influence on elections till now. Like, it was a surprise for me as well.
Yeah. I mean, there's two things there to pull apart. And, I'm painfully aware, two white dudes talking on a podcast. But there's government policy that is like, I wasn't there for the campaign, I didn't see the posters, but a government policy towards body positivity. Cool. You want like education on sexual assault, and sexual assault rates are much higher, I think, than are generally reported. And we have problems in Western societies with dealing with those things. But there's a big difference between, okay, we have to have policies that are going to fix these problems versus, as you said, sort of, okay, men suck, or this, the entire system is broken. The entire system is completely corrupt, and we have to throw it out, and we have to put it in new things, and we all must do all, like, there's two different things there. And I think you can be for the policies on the one hand and be against the ideological, agenda-driven things. And this is where I get in danger, not of becoming a Marxist, but just a materialist, in the sense that the place that I go to try and understand what's happening here is I want to look at it broken down, not based on ideological basis, but on class. And if I look at polls of where Spaniards think of themselves on a class basis, roughly half of Spain identifies as mid to upper middle class. And then, the portions that identify as lower class or working class or lower class poor I mean, it's much less than 50%. This data set that I'm looking at here, that looks like 35% identify in sort of that general area. But so for me, I start looking at the class-based argument just to understand what's going on. And okay, somehow the ideological principles or the way that these extremists are trying to capture some of the mainstream parties is they are serving up these things that get clicks rather than answering sort of the policy needs of the actual people that need them. And maybe that's because, I mean, we were talking about this before we hit record, like the Spanish working class isn't a majority of the population. The Spanish working class is much smaller. You have a much wealthier population relative, and maybe that's why they're going ideological. Maybe that's the data set that they saw. I don't know. I'm grasping for straws to try and explain how a center-left government that has enviable economic data is choosing not to focus on the economic data, but instead is choosing to say that Spain, which to your point, when you look at Spain's laws and its history, one of the most progressive countries in the entire world, and yet not progressive enough. There's something is broken there that I don't quite understand.
Because it's not about progressivism. It's when you put the identity politics thing on the table and you create a narrative where you're saying, no, all the men are rapists. I'm going to make a campaign signaling journalists for being bigots, for making maybe a sexual joke. They made a campaign where they were signaling a journalist that is one of the most famous journalists in Spain. More than a journalist, I would say a comedian, a TV conductor. I don't know. I'm trying to find an equivalent in American TV. But
I think a comedian is the right, probably.
Yeah, you can say a comedian that he has a late night show with 4 million viewers in Spain, where he talks. He's not in the right or he's more or less in the center. Like mass media. He mainstream, like the definition of mainstream. And they try to signal him as a sex predator, because one day when he was making an interview to an actress. The actress was promoting a lingerie brand that she just launched, and he said, "Do you sleep with your lingerie?" And that was like, "Oh, sex predator!" Like that is not just trying to care about women's rights, which is completely fine, and no one is against it. That is trying to create a narrative, a discourse, which is, I'm going to try to capture the women because, hey, look, women, the men are your enemy, and I'm going to try to capitalize this hatred in terms of votes. This is not working. It didn't work in Spanish politics. And I think this is a lecture, like the government did that lecture thinking that this would capitalize in votes, and it capitalized in the opposite. And it's happening also with corporations. Lots of companies now in America that they are trying to become more ideological. I remember 2 years ago, The Economist was talking about the woke capitalism, how now companies, they try to showcase their moral values and stand for things and stand for gay rights and anti-racism and so on, thinking that this would be a good trend and it would translate in a better marketing campaigns, more sales. And what is happening is the opposite. The people are alienated by that.
Yeah,
look at the campaign. In a way, what is happening now is the brutal version of what happened to Gillette and their Not All Men campaign. Do you remember that one?
I don't.
They launched a campaign against toxic masculinity. Gillette, the brand that does razors.
Yeah.
They did that in America, and it was like this ad saying, "Oh no, signaling to what they consider toxic masculinity." They thought that campaign would translate into more sales, but actually it translated into a drop in, I think it was 10% drop in sales in America.
Hey, Gillette, if you're listening, here's some free consulting advice. If you want to do better sales, better razors might be the way to go. I'm just throwing that out there. The one thing I would push back against on a little bit is you said that everybody is for feminine. That's not true. There are real enemies and real governments and real forces within not just Western societies around the world that are against women's rights and that are against rights of minority communities and things like that. And it deserves all of us to fight against them. So it's not everyone, but I do think that is like in the same way that I think the far left that you're talking about is a minority probably of the left in Spain, those groups are minority fringe groups in the right as well. And if you look in the United States, like Donald Trump does not have a majority of the US electorate behind him. What he has is a very rabid minority within the Republican Party that is bigger than anybody else's rabid minority. And because of the way the political system works, that allows him to get on top of the system and he can start doing his populist things and looking
of
sort of
course,
around.
but I mean, wait a minute. The fact that you have a lot of radicalism on the right, on the far right, that translates into Donald Trump losing the elections in 2020 and then having the assault on the Capitol and having a lot of never Trump Republicans. You also have the same on the left. Mm-hmm. Like we, of course, here we're talking about the Spanish elections. The ones who lost the elections are a coalition of the socialists and the far left. Those are the ones who lost the elections. Maybe in 4 years we will discussing about the brutal and unexpected defeat of the conservatives and the far right.
Well, no,
and then
I
we
think
will talk about
I think
the
it's
success on the far right.
I think it's more pressing than that.
This is a story that we can talk about.
In 1 month, we'll be talking about that because we're going to see what happens in these July elections, and we're going to see if we get a return to what you're talking about, which is bipartisanship or a rejection of the far right in Spain, or whether Spain is just going to ping pong from, okay, far left captures government agenda to far right captures government agenda. Because if the right has to include Vox in the Spanish government, it's just going to be a different flavor of radicalism, right? Which, and I know you can't predict elections, but I wanted to ask you, and sort of maybe we'll talk after the election too, as we have a couple more minutes here. Like, where do you think it's going? Do you think it's going to be the People's Party is going to have a majority that stands on your own? Do you think they'll have to reach out to the far right? Is there a universe in which the center right and the center left agree to work to each other and tell all the crazies to go away and fight their battles without having to, piss us all off? Like, where do you think it's going?
I don't know where it's going. Really, honestly, I wish, but this is my opinion, not as an analyst, but as a voter. I wish the center left and the center right were responsible enough to even support each other and try to abandon all kind of radicalism. That's what I stand for. Like, I'm not a radical. I never voted for any radical right party or radical left. No. And Vox also, they have many problems and many infighting, because also Vox was a party that started out as it has the same history as Alternative for Deutschland. Mm-hmm. It started as a party of academics and teachers. It was not teachers, but it was more like it was a spin-off of the Conservative Party, of the PP, created by members of the European Parliament and people who were pretty much smart, but then it got hijacked by the most radical wings of the party, and they tried to copy Donald Trump's campaign. In a way, this is also a beautiful example of how America influences everything. Because the radical left, they tried to copy the woke agenda that they saw in American universities, and the radical right tried to copy the strategies of Donald Trump, to the point that one of the slogans that they have in Vox was, guess what? What was one of the slogans 4 years ago? The slogans that the election slogan that they had in I think the first election where they made it to the national parliament. Guess what was their slogan? Their slogan.
All lives matter. Me too. I don't know, something like that.
No. The far right.
I don't know. What was it?
Make Spain great again. Literally. And of course they have.
If it works.
So, it works. It works. And I mean, Donald Trump won the elections in 2016, and
But wait. So what exactly does that mean in a what does that mean in a Spanish context? Does that mean make Spain a monarchy with a dictatorship again? Like, does that mean?
No, it doesn't mean anything.
It doesn't.
I mean, fighting against the Catalan nationalists. Also, the far right. Why did they become so popular? Also, because of the austerity. Like, it was also the response to the existential crisis that Spain had in 2011, 2014, when we had the debt crisis and everything. The right wanted to, if the left wanted to fight austerity and change the system, the right wanted more, the right, they wanted more austerity and less government and so on. But then that turned into a party of, what really galvanized them was the Catalan nationalism, the independentist movement, and they had a really hard stance against them. So this is somewhat what really made them to where they are now. And make Spain great again, I guess it means fighting the Catalonians. Also, again, let me make a case for Spain and my country. We are a very progressive country again, and even the radical right, in many cases, is not as radical as the center left in Sweden. For example, the anti-immigrant stance is radical for a Spanish standard, but for a Swedish standard or an American standard, is not that radical. You know, they are more where they get more harder is when it comes to fighting peripheric nationalism, which is something that you guys in America you don't have, so you know what is it about. But yeah, like. I wish the big parties, they could be more responsible, but I think they are not going to be. Like, they are gonna fight for their own interest, and if the center right needs to partner with the far right, they will do it. What I think it might happen is that there are several scenarios where we can have. One scenario is that the PP, the center left, the center right, doesn't win an absolute majority and doesn't like, one scenario is that the center right really needs to make a coalition government with the far right, because otherwise they cannot make it to the elections. Another scenario is that the center right doesn't win an absolute majority, but they just need 5 votes in the parliament to make it to the government.
Yeah.
In that case, they can negotiate with the far right and say, no, you're not getting into the government. I will give you some, in order to get your support, I will change XYZ laws, but definitely I'm not gonna get you into my government just because I need 5 votes, because I can get those 5 votes from anywhere else.
Yeah.
So that's something that can happen too. That they will get to the government with the support of the far right, but without having the far right in the government. And I think this is what they want. Because also one of the lessons that they are learning is, if you partner with radicals, the radicals are going to hijack your messaging, and eventually you will not be able to govern, to rule the country in a quiet manner, because you will always have them not only forcing you to pass some laws, but also making incredibly flashy testimonials and interviews and saying a lot of things that then you have to go after them and say, no, we didn't mean that. Okay, we didn't mean that. That was them. Okay, that was them. They are part of our government. And this is something that can happen. It's happening, for example, in my region, the region where I am from. There is a government. There is a coalition between the far right and the center right, and they are already having that. Like every now and then they have to go after, anytime the spokesperson of the far right party of Vox says something, then the spokesperson of the PP has to go after him and say, no. Well, look, that was his personal opinion. Okay, we have nothing to do with this. So this is also something that I don't think it's in a scenario where they want to be, to tell you the truth. And the center right in Spain, and their candidate is very moderate. It's not Donald Trump or anything. Like, the center right candidate is pretty much a It's like the center, the candidate on the center left, like Pedro Sanchez. He wasn't meant to be a radical. Like actually, in interviews before he made the coalition government, he always claimed that I would never partner with the far left. And he was promising that he would never do it. And his first government, when he was governing the country in minority, and he could choose the ministers and he had more freedom to take his own decisions without having to pass it with the radicals, it was pretty much a technocratic government. Like it was not a socialist, unite and proletariat. And no. Actually, the Ministry of Economy is an incredibly technocratic woman. She comes from, I don't know if she was working for a bank or she was working for some institutions in Europe. Like, she was very centrist. And most of the government cabinet was centrist people, maybe a little bit more progressive than the PP, but pragmatist and technocratic people. So they are not that different at the end of the day. It's like bipartisan politics in America. Like, if you think about it, before Trump, Republicans and Democrats, they used to vote in lots of elections in the 80s, even with Ronald Reagan. There was a lot of consensus in the Congress between Democrats and Republicans.
Yes, although the 80s is probably where it goes off the rails. And of course, Make America Great Again was a Reagan expression before it was a Trump expression. But I think you've only done enough vocal exercises for 1 hour of talking. So why don't we put a pin in the podcast there, and we'll have you back on soon, Fonseca. Before you go, tell the listeners where they can find out more about you.
Well, they can follow us on Visual Politic. We are a channel about international politics and economics. Also, they can follow us on Visual Economic. We broadcast in English, Spanish, German, and French. So they can choose the language they prefer. I guess if you prefer to watch us in English, you can just go for Visual Politic ended in K space EN. And you will not see my face. You will see Grant's and Josh's face, but the content is the same. And you can also follow us on Visual Economic space EN, which is our channel about economics.
Great. And hopefully we'll have you back after the election and we can talk about what happens. So thanks for making the time.
Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you so much for listening to the Cognitive Dissidents podcast, brought to you by Cognitive Investments. If you are interested in learning more about cognitive investments, you can check us out online at cognitive.investments. That's cognitive.investments. You can also write to me directly if you want at jacob@cognitive.investments. Cheers, and we'll see you out there. The views expressed in this commentary are subject to change based on market and other conditions. This podcast may contain certain statements that may be deemed forward-looking statements. Please note that any such statements are not guarantees of any future performance, and actual results or developments may differ materially from those projected. Any projections, market outlooks, or estimates are based upon certain assumptions and should not be construed as indicative of actual events that will occur.